my name's Rebecca. This is Rebel Roots, planting seeds for transformation in the areas of alternative housing, homesteading, and health. Today I am joined by Jan, and this is actually going to be a really cool interview. Today's already been a great day, just talking about so many different topics in alignment with alternative living, unique architecture too. I love this tiny home. I can't wait to show pictures. First, we're going to get into the story of this tiny home. We are traveling to Northern California, where the entire tiny home movement began with Jay Schaefer. So cool. So this tiny home is currently parked in Northern California. Of course, it can be delivered or moved anywhere in the United States. We are streaming today to the Tiny House Society YouTube page, the Rebel Roots YouTube page, and the Tiny House Society Facebook page. If you happen to be watching live, don't be shy. Comment, ask questions, get interactive. We love Q&A. And I am going to be bringing up now Jan to the stage. Hello.
Hey, Rebecca. How's it going? Good to see you.
Good. Nice to see you. I'm so excited to hear your story. So you have actually lived in this tiny home and with your son, and then also transforming it sounds like, into a short-term rental. Before we get into photos and how beautifully designed it is, if you want to share a little bit about yourself, your tiny home journey, I know everyone's eager to hear.
Okay, sure. So it's started about 15 years ago. Marriage ended, and I needed a place to live as close to my son as possible. So started a 6x9 shack that I converted into a house on the property, and so my son could stay really close to me. Lived in that for about 2 years, and in that time came across tiny houses and what Jay Schaefer had been doing, and caught the bug along with minimalism and financial independence. So all those things kind of converged for me around that time. And maybe 2 years later, decided to build my first tiny house on a trailer, and which is this house that I'm selling now. So it's on a 14-foot trailer. So you can see the pictures. The purpose was to find a backyard in Berkeley, which is where I live. Within walking distance of my ex-wife's house, so my son could get back and forth really easily. And one of the constraints is tiny houses have to stay tiny to be able to fit them into the backyards in a fairly dense urban environment like Berkeley. So 14 foot was about the biggest I thought I could push it. And one of the constraints of tiny houses is you're limited by the width, you're limited by the length of the trailer, and you're limited by the height. But the area where you can expand is you can increase the volume. And I built a lot over the years. I've been building since my 20s, and I realized if I could push out the rafters and make the rafters curved, I create a lot more volume in the upstairs, in the sleeping loft area. So rafters, I don't know how technical we want to get, but basically glue lam. So it's a 2x6 that's ripped up into 1/4-inch strips and then glued and clamped over a form to create the curve. So I do that, one a day for 2 weeks until I have all the rafters that I need. And that then creates the volume upstairs. And then all the roofing, the insulation, the ceiling, and the actual roofing all sits on top of those rafters. So you actually end up with a lot of extra volume and space upstairs. So I think that's one of the main things I think I've contributed to tiny house building, is that as a design element. It adds a lot of complexity to the building, but what you gain is so much more functional space. There's aesthetic quality, but really it's purely functional for me, is how to make that upstairs loft as useful as possible. A lot of the tiny houses, you really cramped in there, and that's not the quality here. This feels like a really cocoon quality. The other thing that
I was going to say, we can look at pictures too, because it really does. The height in the loft, it's so beautiful, and it makes it like just feel so much more open and inviting and comfortable, like for sleeping quarters. Some of them, it's like a crawl space, and it's so uncomfortable.
no,
But
you can sit up in bed really comfortably. You're not feeling jammed into a triangle. So another, one of my big critiques of tiny houses is a lot of wasted space. Even though people are designing on limited trailers, a lot of that space is wasted. There's this idea of this great room with a high ceiling, but it's like I'd rather not have the high ceiling and have a full loft across the whole building. So this, even though this house is just 14 feet long, there's actually room for two beds upstairs. And so that that became really handy when my son and I were living in it for his mom left out of state, so I was a full-time dad and still am a full-time dad. And so having a space in a tiny house where we each have our room, and we were in this one for 2 years, and the one I'm in now is a 16-footer. And at that point, I put a door in between, so we each had door to close, so have some privacy. But this house is fully functional even for 2 people.
yeah, and that's really fascinating too, because a lot of people exploring minimalism and tiny home living are maybe nervous about, if it's not just you living in the tiny home, but you're sharing the space. How do you still have your own private quarters and that divider wall where it's like, okay, we still have our own privacy, even though we're sharing our tiny home dwelling. So that's beautiful. And it sounds like for a few years you lived in this one in particular with your son, and then what I understand is that you have now even had Airbnb revenue from this tiny home after you guys lived in it. Then the next stage was the short-term rentals.
Yeah, so once I built this one, I actually realized what a great source of passive income these tiny houses can be. Rent accommodation is so expensive, housing is so expensive in the Bay Area, and even building an ADU is 200,000 plus. So, but a lot of the houses have big backyards, and so realized once I started, I built another tiny house and then had this one then available as a rental, and we did it first as an Airbnb. So basically, I partner with a property owner in the Bay Area, and we then put the house in their backyard. And then we split the revenue 50-50. So the whatever rental income, first as an Airbnb and then as the monthly income, the property owner and I split 50-50. The property owner is in charge of, finding the tenant and tenant relationships, and I'm in charge of house maintenance. And I maintain ownership on the house. And so, realized very quickly, I could easily be making $500-$700 a month off of these houses, and the amount that it cost me to build, plus my labor, the return on that is as an investment, was the best way I could invest my money. And so I ended up building 4 tiny houses over the next couple of years that I put in following this model of putting them in backyards and then splitting the rental income. So, and people loved it. The homeowners loved it. They got an instant rental income without having to go through the hassle of building an ADU. And the rental was low enough that folks were getting a place to live where they could close the door and have privacy and not living with roommates at half of what it would cost for a studio 1-bedroom apartment in the Bay Area. So, often we've had tenants staying in there for 5-6 years in these tiny houses, in couples with kids. We've had that as well. So, it really became a model that touched a lot of people and was really beneficial to everyone involved.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so let's just roll through some of these photos and maybe you can explain a little bit about this particular tiny home. I know you're in the process of, that must be really hard to let it go and say goodbye. The tiny home story and like the kind of person you would want to take this on and enjoy it for their future. Whether it's, renting it like you were just talking about or actually living in it full time. So we have the high ceilings you were talking about, the 2 sleeping quarters. This is a beautiful photo of it on that property with the sun in the background. Maybe if you want to share a little bit more about the interior finishes, I can just scroll through all these awesome photos.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole design thing. How do you make such a limited space as functional as possible? Yeah, like I said, I've been building small spaces since my 20s, so I have a good sense of what works and what doesn't work. There've been some iterations. The house I'm in now is, like I said, a 16-footer. Those extra 2 feet helped, I think, to have a bathroom that's a little bit bigger. But the basic layout is the same. The size of the kitchen is, I have a little bit bigger fridge in my current house. But the challenge, as everyone knows, living in a tiny house is how to deal with your stuff and how to pare down to essentials. And it's really this process of curating your possessions. And people have starry-eyed ideals of living in tiny houses, but the hardest thing is dealing with your stuff and being willing to let go of stuff and really getting down to essence. And if you can do that, there's this immense freedom in that of, this is all I need, and I'm really rich in the possessions that I have. And so some just practical stuff that I've done. In that picture, you can see there's a folding out table. IKEA had one. I don't know if they still have it, but the table folds out on the left there. There's a little bracket on a hinge that helps the table fold out. And then to the left of the kitchen cabinet, there's a chair that fits into that slot there. So, when there's dinner time or meal time, the table folds out and the chair comes out and I'm ready to eat. And the kitchen layout, basically a 2-burner propane stove, fridge there in the middle. It has a freezer compartment, so it's not that very small dome fridge. So, you having to, go shopping every couple of days, but even for 2 people, there's room enough in there for the food, and then a small sink. They're up above the sink. Again, it's an IKEA thing, but that hanging rack for the dishes is really handy to just wash the dishes and put it right up on the rack to dry, and that's where the dishes are stored. And then the hooks on that little rack, on that little shelf for hanging pots and whatever utensils you need. So, this fridge, this kitchen layout is about as Spartan as you can get. So, you have to be mindful of shopping and how often you're shopping. To the right there is a built-in bench that comes around as an L. There might be another picture that shows that better. And then underneath the bench is storage. The piece of plywood lifts up, and underneath of that is a lot of storage. That's not quite the picture. But so let's see. We'll find it. We'll come back to it.
Yeah, I don't know if I have one exactly of the bench, but I can definitely put the full listing description in the comments section,
okay,
so that people can see. Because on Facebook, they only let you do like 10 pictures.
Okay.
So I'll put the full listing here in the comments for folks to see all the
So let's see if there's a picture of the ladder, because that's getting up to the loft is always a design challenge.
The ladder a little bit. There we go.
Yeah. So since that picture was taken, I've actually turned the ladder around. So it's now on a hinge And so it's actually, during the day, it just leans up against the wall. And then when you need it, it just folds down, to the left of that opening, and you can get up the ladder that way. And I have the same design. I've done that since on all the other tiny houses. So the ladder just folds out the way when you don't need it. When you need it, it just folds down so you can easily get up into the loft. And that to me is really the simplest, most space efficient way to deal with getting upstairs. A lot of the tiny houses, the stairs take up a lot of the room that's in the house, and that space is then wasted for all the other times when you're not actually climbing up, needing to get up the stairs. So I designed this. I'm a photographer and videographer. I needed a home office, and if you go back to the previous picture, no, next one.
Okay.
So I built like a little office. So if you go, that one. If you go through the ladder there's a desk area where I could put up a big monitor to be editing with 2 filing cabinets. And then to the left of that is the bathroom. And if you can pull up a bathroom picture.
There we go.
There it is. Okay. So, so basically the bathroom, shower to the right there, 24 by 24, 2 by 2 shower, RV shower with a pan. And then, hot and cold water off an electric hot water heater, 7-gallon electric hot water heater. It runs off 120 volt. And then the composting toilet. So, they're all these houses that have been renting out all ran on composting toilets. So it's basically the humanure system. And so you basically use a bucket, separate the urine, solids goes in the bucket with a peat moss, and then once a week the bucket comes out, and then the composting happens in barrels outside. So 2 50-gallon barrels, one gets filled up, takes about a year, and then that one gets capped off, and then the second barrel gets filled up, and the first one is then left for a year, and then after a year all pathogen cycles have been broken, and that's then that it's nature's finest.
And so someone who would be perhaps purchasing this tiny home, moving it onto their own property, there's a tremendous benefit here, right? That they don't necessarily need to hook it up to septic or worry about having those connections or a black water tank. I mean, that's like huge in terms of the freedom of setting it up on any property, right?
Yeah, I mean, my composting toilet's right here. I've been using them for 15 years in tiny houses. It's the most elegant system there is compared to what we have. Flush it down, it all ends up in the bay. There's never any smell. It takes 5 minutes once a week to empty out the bucket, clean up the bucket, and put it back in place. And you have this great resource for the garden afterwards. So I'm really comfortable. I'm happy to share my experience. It's really an idiot-proof system once you figure it out, and it's really simple. There are a lot of commercial composting toilets that have, thousands of dollars, and the composting happens inside the house. There's always a smell. There's always a fly infestation. It's a mess. And this is really the simplest, most elegant, idiot-proof system there is. I have plumbed it. There is a plumbing outlet that if someone wanted to put in a flush toilet, they can. It's available. One of the houses that I've rented is, really right downtown Berkeley, and we did connect it to the sewer system. So it's possible to do that. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, and you can go to like an RV store or even Home Depot and buy a toilet for like $200, right?
Right. Yeah,
So
not a big deal. Yeah,
if you want to, you can always switch it out. But yeah, when I speak with people about these tiny homes, the hardest challenge to overcome truly is figuring out the connections to the water, the electric, the septic system, and the capacity for the how many gallons it has, or if it's a city municipal waste. So this really compost toilets, like you were saying, it actually is a very efficient and clever way to be able to have the mobility and the freedom of being able to set it up on any property, a backyard, etc.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so I can talk a little bit more about the systems. So let's just stay with the water for now. So there's it's this Bosch 7-gallon, 120 volt water heater, and that's where the cold and hot water comes in. And basically, I just run an RV freshwater hose pipe from a faucet that goes into that electric hot water heater, and that then splits hot and cold water into the house, and then then runs like any other house for the shower and the sink. And then the wastewater for the shower and the sink is basically gray water. So hose pipe going from the outlets for the sink and the shower that then goes into the garden. And you've got to be mindful you're not putting down bleach or being Dr. Bronner's for your soap. But that's really safe, and the gardens love that water. And then composting toilet we've talked about already. And then the electrical system is basically 30 amp sub panel, and I think somewhere there's a picture. There might be a picture that shows that whole area that goes from a dedicated circuit from the main house into the sub panel, and then that all runs. Then the electrical inside is then all 120 volt like any other house. Got to be somewhat mindful of running two electrical heaters and the electrical kettle and the microwave at the same time. You just got to be mindful of your loads. But the heating in the house, what I've just used is a small electrical space heater. The house is really well insulated. I've got rigid foam insulation in the wall cavity, so 3.5 inches of rigid foam, and then rigid foam in the floor, and then 2.5 inches in the ceiling, and then low E windows. So the house takes really 5 minutes to heat, and it holds the heat really well.
Amazing. Yeah, and I screen shared. So this is the formal listing page. So my associate Isabella, she's working with you directly to blast this out there to the world. And so I wanted to take a moment to share the story about the tiny home. I really appreciate the introduction she made so that you and I could connect and hopefully find an aligned buyer who will then be able to enjoy this tiny home for themselves. So this is the beautiful listing page that Isabella made. You can contact her directly. Of course, I'd be able to help as well. And I wanted to open up the floor if anyone does have questions. We have 7 people watching live. Woo! Okay. I've been blinded by my blinds. Like the sun is just coming right through my window at this exact moment. So I hadn't really been looking at how many people were watching live. But that's pretty good for being this hour of the day. And if you are watching this after the fact, I know we've live streamed this, but feel free to send in any questions or comments. And Jen, of course, will be happy to connect with you. Do you have any closing thoughts? Are there any lingering, ideas or things that you would like to kind of touch on before we wrap up?
Yeah. Who's the ideal next owner of this house? I think it would be great as a rental unit or as an ADU in a backyard in the Bay Area. Tiny houses are legal now in Oakland, so you get around the legalities with that. At small size, the 14-foot trailer does make it more accessible to get into backyards. but you still need 9.5 feet access driveway to be able to drive a truck through with a tiny house. It's still a lot of weight to move around. But as for a couple or a single person who has property, a friend's backyard, this is a way to live affordably. I still live in a tiny house because it allows me to live very affordably in the Bay Area. And if this house can serve that for the next person, that'd be great.
Amen. Oh, amazing. I love this. Yeah, this is like where the tiny home movement originated. So cool talking with you today and hearing your story. And yeah, it certainly could be delivered or transported anywhere in the USA, but in an ideal world, the closer it is to where it's parked, the less risk in terms of like moving it and cost. It's like $4 or $5 a mile on average to move these. So if you're in Northern California or near there, or in Idaho or Oregon or something, I feel like any of those areas could really work nicely. So yeah. Oh, good. Well, thank you so much for your time. Here's the link once again, folks, if you want to see the full listing page. My name's Rebecca, and I work with Tiny House Society. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing your story living in a tiny home.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, great. I'll just wrap up here quickly then. Okay, y'all, this has been another episode of Rebel Roots. We are planting seeds for transformation in the areas of health, homesteading, and alternative living. If you have any questions about this tiny home, feel free to reach out to me. My email is rebecca@tinyhousesociety.com. And Isabella, my associate, is the marketing director who is also directly working on this listing. We're here to help you if you want to maybe purchase this tiny home or if you have any questions. So feel free to reach out. And I hope that this story inspired you in your tiny home dream living pursuit. So we'll keep in touch. And until next time, peace out. Bye.